So good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to today's session with Spencer Hawkswell from TheraPsil in Canada. And it's really quite a special session today because Canada should be the model for us down under. And Spencer has really been the man on the ground for the last what, 2 to 3 years now. Trying to make headway specifically to give patients access to psilocybin-assisted therapy for end-of-life conditions such as anxiety, etc. We have presented previously on the benefits of it, but Spencer has really navigated the, I guess, legal minefield of giving patients access to these. And really, I want to give the floor to Spencer shortly to give us a first-hand account of his experience. Just briefly, how many of you haven't attended our sessions before? I do recognize some names. You can just raise your hands. Okay, fantastic. So if that's the case, I'm gonna just play a short 2-minute video which explains the work that My Medicine Australia does. As a brief introduction, so my name is Ilan Heyman and I'm the operations manager here. Time does fly. I've been involved at My Medicine Australia for just under 3 years. So I joined just at the end of their first year. And since I have begun, a conversation on psychedelic-assisted therapies definitely has changed. And a prime focus of our efforts has been working with our TGA, which is our working with our TGA, which are the TGA is our main medicine regulatory body as well. And Scott will tell us more about that later. Joining me today is Scott Edwards, who is our chapter and community engagement officer. Scott heads up a small team which deals with approximately 1,500, I guess, grassroots volunteers, and our chapters really form a huge part of our overall strategy, and that's something that we will present later on. But in short, we've got over 35 chapters across Australia, and if you guys want to join that, we will post a link in the chat about that later. So then without further ado, I'm going to just share a short 2-minute video, and then Scott will introduce Spencer, and then from there Spencer can present. And we will leave the chat open during the presentation, and if there's any questions, please do post them and we will endeavor to address them during the Q&A session.
Did you know that over 45% of Australians will experience mental illness in their lifetime? That's nearly half of us.
Everything feels flat and dry. I can't sleep. I don't want to cost. I feel ashamed.
Mental ill health devastates lives and families and costs Australians around $60 billion a year. Research and treatment expenses continue to rise, yet rates of mental illness indicate that we're losing the battle. New approaches are urgently needed to address this immense suffering and cost. Psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy is currently being trialled worldwide and has demonstrated remarkable promise in treating depression, anxiety, addiction, and post-traumatic stress disorder, with new trials underway for treatment of dementia and anorexia. The treatment combines a short program of psychotherapy with just a few medicinal doses of psilocybin or Mdma. In the 1950s and 60s, psychedelic treatments had a major impact in psychiatry, and many considered it the next big thing in mental health treatment. But for political reasons, the Nixon administration criminalised the use of psychedelics and effectively stopped all research. That research has finally begun again. With proper clinical support, psychedelic treatments are safe and frequently lead to remission after only a short program, and even where current treatments have failed. Here at Mind Medicine Australia, we believe everyone should have access to the best treatments for mental illness. We will seek to establish best practice in regulated psychedelic-assisted treatment. Mind Medicine Australia is wholly focused on the clinical application of psychedelic medicines. We're preparing for change by developing therapist training, ethical guidelines, a centre of excellence in psychedelic medicine, educational material and events, and supporting clinical research. We're a small organisation doing big things, and we need your support. Please share this video and visit our website to support us and get involved.
Scott, over to you.
Amazing. Thank you, Alan, and good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here with you all. I'd just like to say a few words of introduction for Spencer, a little bit of which Alan covered and all of which I'm sure he'll elaborate on in detail over the course of the next hour. But he is the CEO of TheraPsil, based in Canada, which is a small non-profit coalition. It's based of healthcare professionals, built up, I should say, of healthcare professionals, patients, community members, and advocates. And they're dedicated to helping Canadians in medical need access legal psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy and medical psilocybin. They do work across multiple different areas in terms of advocacy, education and training and research. And there are a couple of really key achievements that they've achieved. One of which being the success in allowing access to some of those to Canadians in suffering from end-of-life anxiety, end-of-life distress, to access legal psilocybin-assisted therapy, which we're really excited to hear more of today, and also launching a therapist training program, which started in 2021. And before I pass it over to you, Spencer, I suppose what I would just like to express from the team at Mind Medicine is both how impressed and grateful we are for the work that you and your team have achieved. As Alan alluded to at the start, there really is a model that you are putting forward and leading the way for the whole world in Canada. And so we really do find that it's remarkable work, and it's an absolute pleasure and a treat to have you here with us today. So with no further ado, I'd like to pass it over to you.
Thank you very much. And it's really an honor to be here. And I can't say how excited I am to be speaking with an organization who, based on that video, is very much in line and similar to what we do. So I just want to say bravo to the whole MindMed Australia team, because we've definitely been keeping a close eye and keen eye on what you've been doing, and it's amazing to see so many organizations like this pop up, not only just in Canada and Australia, but really around the world. So yeah, it's amazing to be here in 2022 and see how many folks are all very interested in psilocybin and psychedelics, and it's an amazing time to be alive and doing this work. And just want to say thank you very much for all that you do in Australia too. Yeah, I mean, thank you also for the introduction. I guess what I'll start off with is just an introduction to how TheraPsil came about, a bit of the story behind it. And to do that, I feel like it's really important to speak about some of the laws that have been established in Canada over the past 20 years. And the two that I'll focus on are the advent of medical assistance in dying, which in our country started with Sue Rodriguez fighting the government of Canada in a legal battle and actually winning the right to die with medical assistance in dying. And the medical assistance in dying laws in Canada have started off for people whose death is reasonably foreseeable. This is usually reserved for cancer patients or patients with other chronic illness or in chronic pain who are really suffering and for whom there really is no other chance at treatment or at managing their symptoms. And so in 2016, Canada legalized across the country medical assistance in dying, which I recognize for some may still be a sensitive topic. And although perhaps not all Canadians agree with it, there are many Canadians every year, I think in the hundreds, that use this medical assistance in dying to have a dignified death. And so many people call it MAID, medical assistance in dying, and that's what I may refer to it. Other people call it dying with dignity. And that's certainly one of the large organizations in Canada that have helped people access medical assistance in dying. So this has set a very special ground in Canada, and part of MAID come out of about 20 years earlier, a couple of court battles. The ones I'd refer to are the Parker and Allard cases in Canada, in which Canadians were using cannabis, medical cannabis, to manage symptoms from their cancer diagnosis. A number of patients were using it for AIDS, and some patients were also using it for epilepsy and a host of other things. I guess what happened was the Canadian Crown decided it would be a good idea to take these patients to court and to challenge them. And luckily, thanks to some amazing lawyers in Canada, and thanks to our Charter of Rights and Freedoms, specifically Charter 7 rights, which says that every Canadian has the right to life, liberty, and security of persons, meaning that they have the right to secure their own medicine, and liberty, essentially freedom to consume their medicine without being arrested. And so in Canada, these two cases, both for medical cannabis and medical assistance in dying, put us in a very special situation where what we know is that the Canadian Crown and government has made it very clear that we do not limit patients' access to their medicine or to freedom and dignified death. So for patients who have access to cannabis who are dying, it's only common sense that if they should have access to medical cannabis, they should have access to medical psilocybin. And it's important also to realize that those legal decisions were not made because of some evidence, some rich evidence. It was really down to the individual person, for which I think much of Western democracy and is built on, is this foundation of the importance of individual liberties and freedoms. And so the Crown decided that they had to respect that, and that patients who were using cannabis, especially when their doctor was able to verify that it was working for them, should have the right to medical cannabis. And we made the what was called the medical cannabis regulations in Canada, and it's been a huge success for many patients over the last 20 years. And so similarly, when the Sue Rodriguez case came around, and when we were determining what to do with medical assistance in dying, similarly, Canadian patients won, and Canadian patients and doctors were then deemed to have the right to medical assistance in dying. And so this all brings us to about 2019, when I met Bruce Tobin, the founder at TheraPsil, and he was actually working on putting together a court case to take the government to court, based on the assumption that if Canadians have the right to die in Canada, they should have the right to try psilocybin. And this is really something that hit home well for everybody in Canada. And that is both the cannabis users, both the people who didn't believe in cannabis, but might have believed in medical assistance in dying, and even the people who didn't believe in medical assistance in dying. They all agreed that if you have treatment options that aren't working and medical assisted death, that it's very obvious that in between there should be the right to try a mushroom. And so that's really what the focus of TheraPsil has been since day one, is working with individual patients and finding ways for them to exercise their Charter 7 rights in Canada to get access to this medicine. And I think the truth is that there are many different ways to do that. And of course, research is a very, very fantastic way, specifically when you're thinking about much broader scale application of psychedelics such as Mdma and psilocybin. But we realized, and as an organization, we wanted to focus on the individual Canadians who have the right to die, who can't wait for clinical trials, who can't wait 5 years for psilocybin to become a medicine. We wanted to get them help immediately, because the unfortunate truth was, for many of them, they could access medical assisted death in as little as 10 days. So why not get a mushroom in 10 days too? And so we started off with a gentleman named Thomas Hartle, and a woman named Laurie Brooks as our first two Canadians. And Thomas and Laurie this was 2 years ago, and they both had a terminal diagnosis of cancer. And I'm happy to say they're both still alive and very well today, after 2 years of having access to psilocybin and undergoing psychedelic treatments. But back when I met them back in 2019 and 20, it was challenging. And both them and their doctors had tried absolutely everything. And we decided that it would be a good idea to support these individual patients and put them in front of the government. And where Bruce, the founder of TheraPsil, thought that a legal challenge might be the best way, we saw another alternative. And that alternative was called Section 56. And essentially it meant that there was this special law within our Controlled Drugs and Substances Act, which is our drug laws. And I'm sure in Australia, there's a very similar set of drug laws that essentially dictate which drugs are controlled and how they can be accessed. Luckily, we have a Minister of Health who is actually able to grant exemptions to those drug laws. And these exemptions had been created in the past for patients to get access to safe heroin and safe cannabis, again, on an individual basis. And the reason that this exists is our democracy or constitution and these drug laws determined that perhaps there might be situations where it's actually in the best interest of our government to be able to make a decision that impacts an individual patient. And so that's what we exercised. And we put those patients in front of the Minister of Health at the time, who was Patty Haiju. And for about 106 days, every single day, we helped that patient and their healthcare practitioners put out a video on Twitter and Facebook, across every social media platform. We wrote letters every single day, counting the days that the Minister of Health, Patty Haiju at the time, was making dying patients wait to access their medicine, psilocybin. And every day was a countdown too, both towards their possible death and towards days that they might have to choose medical assistance in dying as a treatment, as an option to alleviate their suffering, the final option really. And we were very blessed. This was, again, early 2020, I think, at the height of Mike Pollan's book, How to Change Your Mind, and the real height of the psychedelic renaissance. There were public companies popping up left, right, and center, and we had a ton of support. And the minister actually granted those exemptions. And once they did that, they created a bit of a precedent here in Canada. So while the iron was hot, we struck again with healthcare practitioners and made the assertion that if a healthcare practitioner is going to help the patients get access to psilocybin and is going to have to treat that patient in every other form of psychotherapy, whether it's cognitive behavioral therapy, internal family systems, talk therapy, even massage therapy, the therapist always goes through the therapeutic process to both gain a sense of empathy and also understanding how the therapy works. And that is best practices. That's what we've defined as ethical and the correct way to train a therapist before they start treating patients. And that landed well. And I think we had a really good friend in the Minister of Health, Patty Haiju, at that time. So she granted the exemptions for healthcare practitioners. And just like that, in about 4 months' time, we went from psilocybin being illegal in Canada, and it hadn't been legally accessed since 1970, to patients and healthcare practitioners getting access through Section 56. And again, it was all about the individual patient rights and healthcare practitioner rights to access this medicine. And so it was around then that we really kicked off TheraPsil and decided that as an organization, we need to do far more than just support patients by helping them lobby and advocate. We had to set up a 4-pillar mission. And again, it's really similar to the one that I just heard in the MindMed Australia video. It was to focus on that advocacy, but also public education, because we believe that if you have the right to psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy, if you have the right to anything, on the other side of your rights is a responsibility. All rights come with responsibilities. You have to uphold those rights. And then that means really that we've got to communicate to the public that there are merits and limitations to psychedelics, and that we can't just be pushing them and saying that they work for this and that there's actually limitations and there's safe and ethical practices, but that they also can be a drug of abuse sometimes. So public education became very important to us. The third is professional training as well. And we decided that we needed to support the healthcare practitioners in training, because we could legalize psilocybin tomorrow, but it might take about 10 years. And I say this because this is how long it took cannabis, about 20 years before medical professionals were readily available and able to start prescribing medical cannabis. They just didn't know. And education does take a long, long time. So we've put together a training program on the back of the healthcare practitioners getting access to psilocybin. And to date, we've trained about 200 of them. So in the past year, and we're hoping this year to train about 1,000 more and to just keep scaling that. But we're also super lucky in Canada. There are a bunch of other organizations that are also setting up training. There are even universities that are starting accredited programs to get practitioners and students learning about psychedelics. So this training really is a problem, but one that I see getting solved quite quickly as people realize that it really is going to be an issue of trained therapists able to deliver it. And the last bit is research. So we believe too that it's important to make sure that if you're going to be helping people access a medicine, that you're measuring what you're doing. And I think this is just a good reflection of any policy, that you always measure whether or not your policy is working, whether or not what you're doing is working well, as oftentimes they don't. So we've got a research project set up right now, doing observational research with Imperial College London, McGill University, and Northern Ontario School of Medicine. And we essentially measure how these patients are doing through interviews, questionnaires, surveys, to affirm if the treatment is working. And I'm very happy to say for many patients, it has been an absolute success. But over the past year, we've now helped about, I would say, 100 Canadians get access to psilocybin, both healthcare practitioners and patients. And the only caveat and thing that's really been slowing us down was an election, a new health minister, and a new challenge, as it still is not quite a regulated substance. It is still in the hands of the health minister and thus the bureaucrats to make decisions as to whether or not patients get access. So it's unfortunate, but in the past couple months, we really have seen a bit of a slowdown. And that has unfortunately necessitated quite a bit of fundraising on our part to start advocating very, very strongly and heavily again, putting patient voices back out there and targeting the new Minister of Health, Jean-Yves Duclos, who essentially is the only person in Canada with the power to grant these exemptions for patients and healthcare practitioners. So we've started that along with bringing back the Charter Challenge. So we've got a number of lawyers who are going to be supporting us with a Charter Challenge to take the government of Canada to court if they do not help these patients get access to it through Section 56. I want to keep this quite open. I don't want to just keep talking for the whole hour as well. So Scott, let me know if there's any questions that either you or if anybody on this webinar would like to jump in and ask questions. It's not a distraction at all for me. I absolutely love answering questions partway through, and think it's usually important. That way I don't talk for 40 minutes and lose track of questions that might have been more useful earlier on.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you, Spencer. Well, I'll keep an eye on the chat as well. And if there is anything that comes up, I did just see that we did just have one question that popped up in the chat. Or perhaps it's just popped up, although perhaps it's more of a statement. But we will, as we go through, we'll keep going through. It's fascinating to hear, for me at least, the similarities, but also differences between the regulatory system that you have in Canada as opposed to what we have in Australia. And especially as we're looking at it, like, I suppose the one that comes to my mind is, instead of it being the health minister for us, it's the Therapeutic Goods Administration. So it's an organization that then approves those permits, and then they're actually being approved more actively, but then there's a state layer of legislation, which is where it gets blocked. So there's kind of similarities, but then differences as well between the system that you're working with and then ours, which is a really interesting observation.
And in fact, I've
Absolutely.
just enabled people to unmute themselves. So instead of just having it in the chat, we can now have an interactive discussion with Spencer. And in fact, just on the previous point that you mentioned, I see now that Health Canada is doing a review of all Mdma trials. Is that going to put some sort of pressure on access to psilocybin?
I don't think it will. I don't believe it will. And in my personal opinion, the reason we started off and so strongly with psilocybin is because it's a natural substance. So, cannabis even compared to many other synthetic drugs that people have been advocating for, it's in Canada at least, seems to be much easier, much more palatable to the Canadian public, to liberalize and allow access to things like cannabis and psilocybin. And I really will echo the point that, what we're basing access to psilocybin on is not any clinical data. And it's not because clinical data isn't important. I really believe it is the most important thing, and that the government should be dumping money into clinical studies for psilocybin. But what we're more talking about is individual patients such as Thomas and Laurie, for whom now we have all the evidence you would ever need, 2 years of them taking their medicine. And they're the ones telling the government that this is their medicine. Their doctors are backing it up. We've got the research now. And any human being, and I really emphasize human being, because it's the policymakers who you've elected in who are the ones who should be held responsible. And I always suggest that you hold responsible, because bureaucracies can hide behind layers of people, layers of bureaucracy, and kind of say, well, if Health Canada or if this bureaucracy in Australia is in charge of granting these exemptions, they can kind of say, well, it's for this reason, that reason, that reason. And I'll try and answer the first question here in my response is, this question as to if someone has the ability to get medical assistance in dying, why can't we use psilocybin as well? I've had so many bureaucracies give us hundreds of reasons for that answer, and I can tell you they're all bullshit. Because every time we ask a human being, they always say that absolutely a person should be able to try a mushroom before they choose a drug that absolutely is going to induce cardiac arrest. Never met a doctor who hasn't agreed with that, never met a healthcare practitioner who hasn't agreed with that, a politician. To this day, I've never met a person who strongly believed that. I'm sure they're out there, I just haven't met them yet. So, I'd say that's the advantage of working with the elected officials, because they really can do anything, right? We live in a democracy, and if they believe that this is something the voters want, they have every power in the world to make it possible.
And I think that answer actually leads on to Shannon's question here. So she's doing research, and while she's looking at personal experience, but there is the perceived stigma surrounding drug use, unfortunately. So how do we then focus on the medical benefits of psychedelic-assisted therapy versus the stigma attached to, I guess, the recreational use of these substances?
Absolutely. And for us, we've always been very adamant about talking about psilocybin use in the medical context, not recreational. And to this day, I don't think there's any advantage about talking about recreational, just from a strategic point of view. And I'll admit that have I used recreational psilocybin? Absolutely. As a young student, I did. And do I think that people should be going to jail for that? No. Do I think it should be widely available? I can't really say yes to that either, because there are instances where people use it, unsafely. So, arguing about recreational use, I don't think it's worth it right now. That's just my opinion. Don't take my word for that. I think other people can have arguments, but what we've determined is it is much safer and much more efficacious to instead just make the argument for medical use. So for patients for whom it is a reasonable medical decision, and the only person able to say that is not, someone like me who's not a doctor, but the patient's doctor. And so if you have a patient's doctor who's saying psilocybin at this point in the patient's care or treatment, or given their diagnosis or the treatment options available, is the most reasonable medical decision, then that immediately puts it miles away from any recreational use, and it actually puts it into medical use. And so that's all we talk about, is the medical use of psilocybin, and it's why we're so insistent upon a doctor being there. It's why we're insistent upon trained healthcare practitioners being the ones providing the psilocybin, and where one day maybe society will have the collective understanding and knowledge and say wisdom to use psilocybin in a less medical and perhaps instead of the word recreational, more like spiritual or in a personal growth way. That may happen, but it's hard to say that we're there today. I think we can take this one step at a time and first focus on and reinforce the medical benefit of psilocybin, not recreational yet.
But I think it is more the focus, unfortunately, that these medicines are connected with their more informal use, and that could be holding back the argument to then progress these as clinical treatments.
It certainly could, right? And let's say anybody could make that argument, and I think it's something that we're lucky we haven't seen in Canada. There has been very few arguments about the recreational use of psilocybin. In fact, in the city I live in, Vancouver here, there's probably half a dozen stores that are actively marketing and selling mushrooms in storefronts. And the people in Canada don't care. The government doesn't care. The police don't care. There is no heavy abuse really of psilocybin that's made its way into the mainstream, into the public's, into public concern. It's not really an issue right now. So we're lucky that we haven't seen that. In fact, what we've seen and the biggest issues have actually been with medications, with pharmaceuticals. Those have been the largest drugs of abuse. So again, it certainly can happen, and psilocybin certainly can be abused, but that should never ever be a reason for not allowing someone for whom it's a medicine to access that medicine. So this is why I think regulations and not decriminalization is the right answer, at least at this point in time. Should we loosen the punishments for access? Absolutely. Should we just make it freely available? Perhaps not yet, because then you kind of play into perhaps those arguments that these are, drugs of abuse, and that's not a discussion really that needs to be had right now. Not when we're talking about these drugs as a medicine for people who desperately need them. So I'm sorry I can't say much more than that. It certainly is an argument. We're lucky that we don't have it much up here, but I do understand that it's perhaps a bit stronger in some other places.
Yeah, Elaine, Spencer, it's great to see you, by the way. And
welcome to Peter Hunt, our chairman and co-founder.
Yeah. And
Hi, Peter.
Delighted that you're part of this, because I'm when I look around the world at charities that really are at the forefront, you guys are at the forefront. So thank you for the wonderful work you do. I'm just going to make the point, which you've just made, but relative to Australia, that some people on this call may have seen the Melbourne coroner's recent release of information about death through overdose. And it really sort of backs up what you're saying, that when you look at the statistics, psilocybin isn't even there. Mdma is small, but one of the biggest ones is actually overdosing on SSRIs. So you've got a situation where the pharmaceuticals that are being handed out now to a large number of people in Australia are actually causing their own problems. Spencer, one of the questions I had for you is that you've talked about elected representatives. If you're looking at the Canadian legislature and the people in that, how many of them do you think would actually be able to respond intelligently to a question about MDMA therapy or psilocybin therapy?
Not a ton of them at the moment, and that certainly is something that we need to change. I mean, we're probably going to be starting lobbying again in the next couple months here, and that will look like trips to Ottawa, to our nation's capital, to start having meetings with these people. The nice thing is that it is becoming a bit more of an issue as medical assistance in dying laws are actually broadening in our country. So the government of Canada is actually going to be, we refer back to these MAID laws that I was talking about, opening it up to, death no longer needs to be foreseeable. And so this is a huge issue in Canada, and a lot of these MPs are going to be receiving both complaints and support from their constituents, and being able to respond and be educated on, well, what other adjunct therapies are available for people approaching the end of life, that is one of the, recognized by many MPs as one of the most important issues with MAID, is that we can make it more accessible, but you can't just make that more accessible. You've also got to make other options for people who are dying more accessible. Otherwise, we run the risk of, making medical assisted death extremely, accessible, and making all the other things like access to safe and affordable and effective palliative care less accessible. So these MPs want to be armed if they're defending medical assistance in dying with other initiatives that are taking place. And I think that's going to be a big piece of our strategy, is showing that there are other tools that patients can have access to, other medical tools such as psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy. And so far, that's been incredibly effective, Peter. As you kind of have to give some of these MPs the reason why. Why should they care about this? That's been one really, really good why for them. And the other one that we've just started as well is using a tool to send emails. So allowing patients to actually email their representatives, asking them personally as their constituents to look into this matter and to support regulations. We've written regulations, put some packages together and sent that out. The only problem is, for many MPs, unless many of their constituents are asking for this, it really just isn't an issue for them. So we're trying to change that really by showing exactly how many of their constituents are interested in this. And I think we've got about 200 MPs across the country who have had letters sent to them. Some MPs have had upwards of 300 individual letters written in support of this. So those are the MPs that are really, really behind this. And I think after they see the changes that have or how this has impacted the patients, their constituents, once they've seen it with their own eyes, they absolutely want to be a supporter of it. After they see the polls, they want to support it too. So, good question. MP education is so important.
Yeah. I should just add over here, we have this bizarre situation where in most states and territories, euthanasia under certain conditions is perfectly legal, but these substances are not legal in terms of therapy. Somebody who wants to access them and does have a terminal illness. So it's a very strange dynamic that you can legally kill yourself, but you can't legally access these therapies to make whatever time is available to you as peaceful and as spiritual, frankly, as possible.
That is quite bizarre. And I wonder, do you know of any, I haven't looked into it, but any court cases that have ever, charged patients for access to psilocybin, or have there been any large court battles in Australia to try and challenge the laws that might make that paradox apparent?
Not in relation to euthanasia, but we do have a court case coming up in July, which I might just say a few words about. In Australia, we've got a psychiatrist who's applied for Mdma-assisted therapy for a patient who's got severe PTSD. The patient's tried everything. The patient is described by the psychiatrist as at risk. He was able to get special access scheme approval from the TGA. He then went to the Victorian government, Victoria being the only state where there is an approval process available for a Schedule 9 substance. And his application, despite the fact he had federal government approval, his application was rejected by the Victorian government, and rejected, frankly, for reasonings that are quite spurious. So what's happening now is the psychiatrist, with our support, is appealing that decision of the Victorian government, and that appeal will be heard in July. And that's the first time, to my knowledge, there's been a legal case in Australia, and others may correct me if I'm wrong, where this inability to access these therapies in Australia legally is now being challenged. So we'll see what happens. But at MMA, we're determined, like you have been, to really, where we can see an ability to use the legal system to think very seriously about doing that. Yeah.
No, I think that's genius, and really I can't stress more the importance of individuals, right? This patient and their doctor being behind that. That's what the legal system at least through our understanding up here in Canada, is designed for, right, to protect individual rights. And so in just about every case that we've brought to the government as well, and I think I should mention that 3 other times we have brought a case to the government. The first was for Thomas and Lori back in 2020, when we were advocating. We made it very clear to the government that, you know, you can go the easy way and you can support these patients and do what's right and do what the majority of Canadians believe is right for Canadians to access psilocybin when they have access to MAID. Or you can fight us over here. And we actually have the exact same legal team as the one that won the Parker and Allard case, John Conroy, Kurt Tusaw. And those lawyers knew that the government would back down, that they wouldn't fight again, because if you look at the rulings, it's just, you know, anyone without any formal legal training can look at it and go, well, obviously that would apply to psilocybin. So 3 separate occasions, we first brought the first patients, then the healthcare practitioners, and then another patient whom didn't have an end-of-life diagnosis, so was not eligible for MAID. We actually brought a case to the government for that patient, and every single time the government backed down. And it would appear to me that, at least again in Canada, I'm sorry, I don't know more about Australia's current laws or even guidelines, but in Canada, it would appear that our prosecutors' guidelines in the country are actually clearly stated on the Canadian Justice website. The prosecutors are not to charge patients for medical use of any controlled substance. And so I think that's part of the reason why earlier when I mentioned there are stores downtown Vancouver that are selling mushrooms, they know that while they may be breaking the law, what they're doing is absolutely in line with the Charter of Rights and Freedoms in Canada, because every time they sell a mushroom to a patient, they make sure that they have from that patient a written medical form saying that, you know, they have a diagnosis and might need mushrooms. So in those instances, I believe that the reason the police and the government are not cracking down on this is they know that they will lose in court. And that seems to be what's happening right now. And I believe that's it. So, you know, my hope is that we will bring a legal case to the government. We need to fundraise quite a bit to file that case because of the massive amount of evidence that we have. But if we can actually put that case down, those politicians are most likely going to take us quite seriously. Because at that point, Jean-Yves Duclos, right, our elected health minister, in the public, we know that there will be a news story that this man is taking patients to court and strongly believes that these patients should have the right to die, but not the right to try psilocybin.
Yeah, it's bizarre.
And that itself is political suicide. And we believe that is exactly what it unfortunately takes to have patients' voices heard. Is you have to put a certain amount of stress and pressure on the politicians whose responsibility it is to respond.
Just on that, one of the questions that is in the chat is from Kat. Keen to hear more about the actual experience that patients go through. And I've prefaced that by saying that, you know, in some of those studies, patients talk about the experience as being one of the top 5 experiences of their lives. Just talk us through the sort of feedback that you've been getting from patients.
Absolutely. One of my favorite stories I heard back from a patient. This was one of the first patients. They really made apparent for me this, and it was after their journey, they realized, you know, they were looking for a cure to their cancer, to the fact that they were dying. And what they found was healing, not a cure. And I believe that when we talk about psilocybin, there should be a very clear difference between the two, because psilocybin does not cure maybe anything. And maybe even saying, you know, a cure to depression, a cure to anxiety is the wrong way of looking at it. Yeah. And that in fact it is relationships. And so the conversation that ensued with this patient, and it has happened with many, many others since, essentially goes like this, is they found out that they were dying and they were pissed the hell off. They were absolutely pissed and upset, and it was wrong. They felt robbed. And it was so easy every day to walk around with this great cloud over their head. And the cloud was always there. And, you know, you smile and you try to look happy, and maybe you're at a birthday party, but then you sneeze and you remember that it's because you're sick and it's because you're dying. And so what it really was this relationship with who they are now. And that was the problem, is that's not who they were, it's something they had. And, you know, having something like cancer, it really does sometimes turn into something you have, instead become who you are. And they realized that that was a negative relationship that they had with their diagnosis. And upon taking the psilocybin, realized that it really is a relationship, and one that could heal. Is all of a sudden they could have psilocybin, have cancer, but not be a cancer patient, not be, you know, surrounded by this cloud. And so when you think about a cure, you know, it can't solve the fact that you're dying. You know, this patient is dying, and the truth is that everybody on this call is dying. We all are. You know, no one gets out alive, and it's gonna get us all. And you know, the difference between the person who maybe has a year left to live but it's old, and accepting it. We all know that archetype in our head, right? The old soul who knows their time is near and is happy. You know, they likely feel that way because they weren't robbed, because they had, you know, a long life, and usually a cherished one, and their time is there. They're dying still, but the relationship is a healthy one. And so the way we use the psilocybin, and the way the psilocybin is working for these patients, is it's healing the relationship that they have with the fact that they're dying in, you know, maybe 3 months, maybe a year, maybe 2 years. And the truth is that everybody has that relationship, but for some people it's coming sooner than others. And that shouldn't be a reason, you know, to be upset all the time, to be anxious, to be depressed. It really is healing a relationship with death. And everybody eventually comes to term with their death. They have to. And so when we think about, you know, what is the method of action, right? The scientific approach, what exactly is changing? It's so difficult to say what it is, right? Is it a switch in the brain that's flicking? It's not. It's a relationship. It's an understanding, and the context of one's death is changing. And so the patients aren't getting any healthier. And, you know, that's quite at odds with the way our drug systems are designed to look at substances. Is it working? Is it shrinking the tumor? What's it doing? It's making them okay with the fact that they're dying. And so we really aren't curing anything. We're just healing people's relationship with death, with their cancer, with their diagnosis, so that they are not what they have. Instead, they are who they are. And they may have something, but they can put it away, and they can be there for their family. They can be there and enjoy the time that they have left. So I also want to add one thing to that too. I think it's important. I really have been focusing on palliative patients. This has become more available for a number of other patients, and I think it's always important to not just focus on death. We've seen a number of people who have accessed it for PTSD, for addiction, for chronic pain as well, cluster headaches. It's to me one of the most interesting cases are a number of patients who have cluster headaches, which if anyone has not learned about them yet, I really suggest you go look them up. Likely the most painful diagnosis known at all. It's some of the patients report that it feels like needles being, you know, injecting hot acid behind their eyes, being brought to their knees multiple times a day, and that itself creating PTSD. The nickname for it is suicide headaches, because of the number of patients who quite literally will commit suicide or claw their own eyes out and mutilate themselves because of the pain. It's a horrific thing, yet these people are using psilocybin, and it's allowing them to live a completely normal life. And so, you know, where there may be a lack of research, and even where I was saying, you know, this healing, perhaps in a more psychological, with one coming to terms with their death, it's hard to say exactly what's happening for the patients with cluster headaches who aren't taking full 7-gram doses. They're taking smaller doses and it's working. We just don't know with some of them, so we don't always know. And so I want to also add that it's not just about the coming to terms with death. For many other people, there are other things that are being healed, and maybe it is pain, maybe it's chronic pain, but it also can be just their relationships with other people. It can be the outlook on their life. It can be coming to terms with the fact that the war is over, and that they don't need to be scared. So many different stories have emerged from patients, and they all are vastly different. And I really believe and want to share that because it kind of speaks to perhaps our inability to reach these patients with clinical research sometimes to fully understand what's going on. Sometimes it makes sense just to step back and say, well, is it helping? Is it working? And maybe we may not understand it, but again, is it a reasonable medical decision for you to try it? And many times it is. So it's not always about knowing what's happening and how it's helping them. Sometimes it's just about being incredibly patient-centered, and when you hear that it is helping, encouraging the use and making sure that it's done safely.
I'm glad to hear you say that, because sometimes we come across people in the sector who say to us, look, we don't really understand how these medicines work. We need more research, more time before they're made available. And just to take your point, I mean, our view is that all the trials to date show that they can work in the right circumstances. To wait until you really understand them is sort of like, why? We don't really understand SSRIs, but we've been using them for 30 years. There comes a time when if something works and it's safe, why wouldn't you make it available to people if they choose to use it? There's no force here. It's all optional. So thank you for that point. There's a question there in the chat, which it's an interesting one. It's about the use of psilocybin for PTSD, and you've just mentioned that. And I have to say personally, my question about psilocybin for PTSD is you're already talking about people who are traumatized by definition. And then you're going to put them through an experience, which I think the stats say 25% of the time, the experience is not a great experience. It can be really challenging. Is there any sort of, what is the evidence about the safety of using psilocybin with people who are by definition already highly traumatized?
That's a great question. Again, to say the evidence is there, there's not enough. We don't know, right? We don't know yet, and rigorous, clinical studies and data will have to become available before I think I'm ever comfortable speaking to say, like, this is how it works and this is how we can treat people. And I think there's a certain amount of wisdom in saying that, if we really want to understand it, we should wait till the research is there, right? I understand that, but again, we're human beings, we're not robots, right? Like the amount of patients that we've treated who come to us and they say, yeah, I've got cancer, but I'm also traumatized, right? Like the cancer diagnosis, and I'll give one example of a patient named John, and I'll just change names and for confidentiality, but John, had a cancer diagnosis, but John wasn't afraid of death. John was, living in the past, and he had been in Vietnam. And, one way to really trigger your PTSD is to find out that you're dying, to find out that maybe you don't have time to, reconcile some things that maybe you wanted to. And so, that's one instance of a patient for whom psilocybin helped to actually cure not the fact that they were dying and maybe their fear of death or the anxiety around it, but the PTSD that they had. And so, you look at patients who are again dying, and you say, well, what's their diagnosis? And this is really one of the limitations of working with Health Canada on this is, we're bringing these patients to the government and saying, well, what's similar with all of them? So what is similar is that they're all dying of cancer or some chronic illness. And now it's actually much more extended than that. That's one similarity, but what else do they have? And many of them have PTSD. I mean, PTSD it is highly problematic. Many people have it. Some of the patients that we've treated have been firefighters, cops, paramedics, veterans. So we don't necessarily say, well, we're using psilocybin to treat their PTSD. We say that it's to treat the end of life distress. But again, what the doctors and psychiatrists and patients come back and say is, well, it had the, the effect of actually curing the PTSD. Again, that's not everyone. For some patients, it did not cure their PTSD, but maybe it cured their anxiety. And for some others, maybe it just made it a bit better. Again, what we've seen and what we're really hoping to back up with our observational research is just that, how many of these patients reported that their PTSD got better. Because I've heard so many instances of that. And while the research may not be there, just because there's a lack of research, does that mean for someone who is completely treatment resistant? And again, I'll take it back to medical assistance in dying in Canada, because very soon those people who are treatment resistant may have the ability to access medical suicide or medically assisted death. Absolutely. It becomes a reasonable, and I'll take it back to human choice, right? A human decision to say that they should have access to psilocybin. So a little bit of separation sometimes from, a very medicalized or a research-focused approach actually, is patient-centered and maybe is a bit more holistic and human-centered.
Look, I'm conscious of the time, and I'm looking at Scott and Ilan here. Are there any last questions that people would like to ask? Because if not, I'd like to finish with just a few comments.
There was one question that came up earlier that I think maybe would be certainly the person who asked it would appreciate it, and I'm sure some others would, which was if you could maybe speak a little bit to some of the nuances and differences between the Section 56 exemptions and the Special Access Program, which, as I understand it, is a change in the landscape in Canada recently.
Absolutely. So the Special Access Program is quite new, and we're still exploring it. Essentially what it is it moves, so I was talking about how the Minister of Health is the one who has the ability to grant patients access through Section 56. The Minister of Health likely asked Health Canada and our government, get these away from me. I don't want to be the one responding here. Create a system that allows access. And in Canada, we have what's called the Special Access Program, which is primarily used for drugs, not for therapies, but drugs such as, say, Traffica, the substance used to treat patients with cystic fibrosis. And so if that substance isn't available in Canada because it hasn't gone through the right approval process or hasn't met our criteria for being an approved drug, then they can access it through the Special Access Program. Unfortunately, in Canada, about 10 years ago, our conservative government removed the ability for controlled substances to be available through the SAP. They were attacking heroin users who were using the Special Access Program to get access to safe heroin. And so that stopped, and recently they again made it available. The problem seems to be, though, is it is still an arbitrary decision in the hands of bureaucrats. And we've had 6 patients get access through the Special Access Program. And the nice thing is they actually got a safe supply. So Section 56, I'll add every patient that we've treated through Section 56 has brought their own mushrooms. So found them on the gray market, grown their own, or got them from a friend. And the SAP actually allows them to get it from a company in Canada. And it looks like 2 companies so far, Cygen, based out of Calgary, and I think Filament here in Vancouver or in BC, have been getting these patients access. One of the biggest issues, though, is the amount of effort it takes, both on the doctor's part. It puts the responsibility onto the doctor, and we're finding that a lot of doctors aren't quite yet comfortable using the SAP. So we've had a lot more success through Section 56. And Section 56 is also allow the patient to actually possess and hold the substance. SAP is more one-time use, again, it's kind of better and more built to be used in hospitals where doctors are administering a drug a number of times. Whereas with Section 56, it really allows the patient to possess and hold and use their substance. Many of the patients that we've been working with microdose, choose to microdose, or just like finding your own mushrooms and doing the therapy with their therapist. That has been incredibly cost effective. Usually the treatments have costed around $2,000 to $2,500. Whereas what we're seeing with the SAP is that given the amount of time, effort, overhead, it's almost double the price. So some of the treatments, are around $4,000 to $5,000. So we're really working hard right now to lower that. We've actually are working on a letter of intent right now, TheraPsil, to work with a number of different companies to make that more accessible to patients. And it looks like the way we're going to be doing that is really focusing more on the community of doctors and therapists who have gone through the training program, focusing on the clinics, the various clinics that are set up around Canada, and trying to remove the administrative overhead and burden associated with the SAP. So we'll continue to try and change that. We're still unsure though, because again, the decision is still arbitrary and put in the hands of bureaucrats. So in my opinion, even worse than a minister, really no one's accountable.
Yeah, well, that has shades in Australia as well. So that's a point well made. Look, if I could just say to everyone on this call, I think many of you will know that we tried to get psilocybin and Mdma for medical use rescheduled. We applied in July 2020. It was finally knocked back in December last year. The beauty of whilst the bad news was it was knocked back, the good news is they had to give reasons. And that means for the first time, we can now respond to specific reasons given by them. And we think we can address all of those reasons. What we've done is we've lodged another rescheduling application. We lodged it early March, so we didn't waste any time. The public submission period now is open for comment on our applications. And Scott and Ilan will send you all a link to which will explain the public submission process. If we can get this through, then what it means in Australia is that we know psychiatrists can get approval at the federal level for the use of these therapies. The problem we have, which I don't think Canada has, is that health is controlled both by the federal system, by the federal government and state and territory governments. And because of these recreational drug laws, if a psychiatrist who had approval from the federal government tried to use the treatment in a state or territory, they could be criminally liable for breaching recreational drug provisions, which, when you think about it, is absolutely ludicrous. If we can move these substances to Schedule 8 on a medical basis, then permit systems open in every state and territory around Australia. And we can start making sure that the state and territory governments are properly positioned to give approvals. So it's an incredibly important rescheduling that we've proposed. Last time around, we had 600 submissions, 96% in favour. This time around, we really want like 6,000, 10,000 submissions, because we want to demonstrate to the politicians, the regulator, and the regulators at both the state and territory levels and the federal level that the time for this has come. And so what I would ask all of you to do is have a look at the submission process. It's very easy to do. Go online when you get the link from Scott and Ilan, lodge a submission, but also ask your friends and colleagues to lodge submissions. So we really inundate our regulator with lots of submissions, basically saying, look, the evidence is quite clear. These therapies can be used safely. They can be effective. Now is the time when the choice should be between the medical practitioner and the fully informed patient. The bureaucrats shouldn't be stopping this from happening. So please get involved, because this is a time where we need you all to be part of this process. And boy, isn't it going to feel wonderful if we can get this through? And suddenly we see people with treatment-resistant depression, treatment-resistant PTSD, getting access at their choice to these therapies through our medical system. So that's that. And just to finish, Spencer, thank you for being part of this. We often get webinars led by researchers, and they're fabulous researchers. But when I think about you and your colleagues, you've been at the front line now for quite some time, trying to change a system in Canada, which enables people to actually access these therapies legally. And I think on behalf of all of us in this call, I want to thank you for your determination and perseverance, and the inspiration you give us just to keep going and make sure that this becomes part of our medical system, so that patients and their medical and health practitioners start to have a choice to use these therapies if they and the patient believe they're appropriate. So with that, if we could all thank Spencer in the normal way, and as I say, Spencer, you're an inspiration, and please pass on our thanks to all of your colleagues who do so much great work in Canada.
Absolutely will, and the feeling's mutual. Thank you all in Australia as well for the work that you do. This is about leadership, I think, on a global scale. So I hope our countries can make this available to the rest of the world as well.
Thank you everyone for being part of this